fucking niggas since the 5th grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
So don't turn off Blood Satellite. Don't turn off
Blood Satellite, the only show that makes all parallel universe cells gay, and you're the only straight one.
How long have you had that in the chamber? Oh, nice.
Don't ask that question. It must seem spontaneous. It's not like I had it in big block letters on an entire notebook page.
You got like a line of post-it notes across the wall. The reason you're reading it that way is because you have to like scan your eyes across the room to each of the post-it notes to read the words. Good job.
Just mouthing slurs as I'm reading, like nigger, fuck, kite, fuck, nigger, shit. There, yes, gay. It's the gay one. And there's just a whole gay wall. And we missed the one. So the one joke, we burned it on the voice chat we did with everyone to apologize for not doing the show. The voice chat of the guys. It was I've been laughing at it for 2 days, and so I think it still works. It's the guy going, "It's my cheat day," and he turns on God mode and no clip.
Terrifying thing is, it's usually a woman who says it's my cheat day.
It's my cheat day.
Like, I want a woman with no clip.
Yeah. Do not give a woman give all. Okay. Give _all. I wanted to add just a part that kind of builds off of the last episode we did. So the last episode was about cybernetics, and it was about the human use of human beings, as you'll recall. The book about cybernetics and the role of information in the human being, in human existence, and the parallels you can draw between a human being and a machine or artificial intelligence. Not 100%, but there are certain parallels in how they think, how they learn, and what each can do. And how the marriage between these two entities will kind of define humanity going forward. But deeper into this, and we kind of touched on it a little bit when talking about it, deeper into it, though, is information theory. And information theory is sort of a current and evolving idea that dictates a lot of what's being done in quantum mechanics, first of all. So, and it's relatively modern, but it's based in biology, and it's based in mathematics, it's based in a lot of other disciplines, and unites them in a sense. And there's this book that I had read called The Information, A History, a Theory, a Flood by James Gleick. So this is a pretty popular, best-selling book. I know best-selling doesn't mean a lot these days, but it's a pretty good book, and it's pretty long. It's pretty in-depth, and what it does is it tackles information theory like a lot of these books do by going, pretty far into human history and defining like what is communication, what is a message, how do we communicate, what does that mean? And we kind of talked about that a long time ago when we talked about the book Anthropomorphics by Dennis Bouvard and the originary theory. And that deals with language. That deals with the power of language and the relevance of language and how it changes how you think and interact with each other and address the unknown, and how that maps onto rituals and things like that. That's all. Go back and listen to that. We'll probably be talking about it a lot in the future. But what information theory seeks to do, and this is very hard to do because it exists in this gray zone between the materialistic and sort of the existential and theoretical, because it says that, in short, I'm going to try and do my best here. We're going to go into this more, but to try and do it my best now, that the entire universe is built on information. That's all everything is. And what do you mean by information? Because when you say information, you think of data, you think of broadband, you think of a telephone call. There's this sort of, maybe, is it electricity? Is it like packets of energy? Is it photons? What is it? And the answer to all of it is yes.
All language allows you to take a thought or mental object and break it down into a series of conceptual chunks. These chunks are externalized using a series of signals or symbols. Humans express themselves using a variation in sound and physical action, as do chirping birds and dancing bees, and man-made machines exchanging a dancing stream of electrical vibrations. Even our bodies are built according to instructions stored inside microscopic books known as DNA. All are different forms of one thing: information.
You know, the very short way of saying it, there's a quote in information theory where it says, it from bit. And what does that it from bit mean? Because bit, we understand the word bit as in terms of computers and cybernetic theory, but bit is also within this superstructure. Bit is the fundamental unit of information. It's actually the idea that you can measure information as if it's a thing, as if it's a material thing, as if it exists in this universe as something you can look at. And that makes more sense once you get into DNA, and once you get into genetics, and once you get into, you know, the code that we kind of pass on to our offspring. So, and this is where we start grappling with different ideas about identity and about hereditary concepts, and, you know, how much does what you inherit from your parents dictate your current behavior and your intelligence. Now, there's a lot of liberals who don't want to talk about that, and we're not even going to go down that road. But just to say that this idea that within your DNA, there's a code, it's a genetic code, it's a pattern, it's a sequence, it's a genome that is passed on. And this information can take the physical form of particles, but also actual organic material. So it's replicating. Everything's about replicating. We talked about that last time, about like what makes a good message. A good, successful message is one, in short, that makes it from point A to point B. But it's only in transit where it starts to suffer entropy and breakdown and now can be misunderstood. What you're actually trying to do is replicate. You got something you want to say, you got information, you have a message, you want to replicate that in the other person's mind. So, and then you use a whole process for that. You have information, you encode that into language, you transmit it, maybe through the air, maybe through a telephone, maybe whatever. And you're hoping by the time it gets to the person, it's re-encoded, and then there's a computation that goes on in their head, and then that message is understood. Now, what could impact that message? Well, maybe there's a lot of noise. Maybe you said the wrong thing. Maybe you used the wrong word. So the message you're trying to get across was misconfigured in the language itself. So once you understand, like, oh, this behaves like an organism. What this is, it's, okay, we're actually trying to replicate. This is all about information that replicates. Now, that could be a message you say, or it could be your DNA replicating in another person. And, you know, this is where Richard Dawkins comes in, where he says all human beings is a sort of genome replication machine, that we have inside of us this thing called DNA, and it's formed this body around it to withstand the forces of radiation, of wind and fire, of everything. And it's not perfect, but it's still kind of evolving. And so, and it succeeds by replicating. And that's what you do when you have kids, when you have families, is that your genetic code is replicating. So once you see, okay, what is information? Well, information is something that can exist in the physical world. It can be looked at. You can look at DNA, and that's information. So information isn't just, you know, a file on your computer, because what is a file on your computer? Well, we can look at your computer and look at the motherboard, look at the CPU, look and see exactly how that information behaves in the system. It's not going to look like anything to a regular person, right? But that file on your computer does exist in the material world. It's not in the ether. There's no such thing as ether. There's no such thing as this magic portal. The only reason any of this exists is because we figured out how to actually make information as a practical physical thing. And once you realize that, you're like, okay, so information exists, like we exist. Okay, so that's kind of what information theory is about it redefined the area of genetics and introduced the concept of information carrying units for something else. And information was coined in the 20th century as a quantifiable thing that can be measured in bits, which actually linked mathematics and engineering to communication, because you're thinking, okay, what does all this mean? Like, we could have information in math, but what is math? Once that starts mapping onto engineering and you're making devices that can measure it, that actually links mathematics as this abstract thing, which everyone complained about for a long time, that mathematics was too abstract. But information theory managed to link mathematics and engineering, and that's how we get computers. And if you look at how computers developed over the history, you'll start to see how how practical it actually was, going from like a steampunk machine to what we have now. But it all started with quantifying information and data as a real thing you can kind of fuck with. And this is where they get into simulation theory as well, which we're not going to get into. But if you start thinking like that, you start thinking, oh, okay, so the universe is just a big computer. And that's where people kind of get lost in that, saying, is this a simulation? Are we just a computer program? They would say no, but we kind of function like a computer program, or a computer program functions like the universe. That's another way to look at it. That, the universe is just quantum materials being carriers of information and patterns. And the universe is like a big computer keeping track of these exchanges. So it operates kind of like a computer, but on a much, much larger scale. Now, we won't get too much into that, but that is one avenue you go down. And he goes all the way back to like the dawn of writing. So, and this is where it's like, okay, we start with oral language. He gives the example of like African tribes. So the move from an oral language to a written language is very important. A lot of people would agree with that. Not only is it important for record keeping and all that, but it's important to how you actually think and how you can think abstractly, right? So it's like the idea of taking messages and writing them down. Now they have a physical form that lasts beyond when you say them. Now, if you are just an oral tradition, to make that leap, it's a total paradigm shift. The idea of saying, I can say something and it lasts even after I'm dead, that blows your fucking mind. And if you don't actually make that leap, there's a lot of things that you can't do as a people or as a group or as a whatever. Like, you're always going to be stuck in this arguably animalistic way of living, which is what you see with a lot of these other tribes and stuff. But he said, writing as a technology requires premeditation and special art. Language is not a technology, no matter how well developed and efficacious. It is not best seen as something separate from the mind. It is what the mind does. Language, in fact, bears the same relationship to the concept of mind that legislation bears to the concept of parliament, said Jonathan Miller. So that's just one thing when he's talking about like the importance of language and how language is what your mind does. It is your mind's technique. And if it's locked into just one form, that's only one thing it can do. But what written language does, he talks about this later, about like the dictionary. It was like the Westerners, the Europeans who invented the first dictionary. What is a dictionary but a language thinking about itself? Again, that's a trippy thing unless you were raised in it. If you're just raised in a world where, okay, we write things down, what is a dictionary? Because he was talking about the very first dictionaries were very, very practical, because they realized in English, like, we write these words down, but there actually is no consistent word. And you see this if you go back in time and read these you can find old posters and old newspapers where sometimes the exact same word, like in the 1600s, is what I'm talking about here. The standardization of words. This same word will be written 5 different ways within the same paragraph sometimes. So to sit down and standardize the language is like, that's never been done before.
Somehow the idea of producing a monolingual dictionary, in which there were a table, probably alphabetical, of English words with their equivalents in English beside them, it never occurred to anyone to do such a thing. It was as if the English language was a great sort of inchoate mass, like the atmosphere, the air we breathe, and we just sort of took it for granted. It was there, we used it all the time. And actually, to measure how large it might be, or to investigate what its component parts might mean, we felt that we had an intuitive understanding of what everything meant, and there was no real need for us to have a book which told us what it meant or how big it all was. But everything changed in 1604, but not until 1604, which meant that, when Shakespeare and Dryden and Swift were writing their poetry and their plays, they didn't have access to dictionaries. It's part of the genius of their achievement that they managed to do what they did and create these incredible lexicons and vocabularies themselves, that they never had access to any book in which they could look up words that they weren't sure of.
And other Eastern languages exist kind of differently, the way they build their languages. But it was the Europeans who decided to standard this one word that everyone's going to use, right? And that's it. And if you spell it wrong, you're wrong and you're fucking stupid. And no one knew what to do with that. No, that's a new fucking idea. But now this signals the language thinking about itself. So language isn't just a way to communicate a message. Language is something you use to investigate the language itself. So here we go. Now we have a meta understanding of language. So as the language itself develops, the information about that language it develops as well. And now you're thinking about thinking. That's kind of what philosophy is. You're thinking about thinking, and if you don't have a written language, there's a lot of that that's locked off to you if you don't make these necessary leaps. So like the ability of wrangling the whole fucking continent and trying to make everyone use the same word, that took a long time, people weren't even convinced that it mattered. But it was left up to like a few people who said, no, it's going to be better in the long run, believe me. But thinking about it materialistically, and once you think about language materialistically, then that's where you get the written language. That's where you get books. That's how you have the language interacting differently with the physical world. And you can write things on signs now, and that sign takes on like a form of its own. That's kind of how you get advertisement. Like you can go down all kinds of kooky paths with this, but it has to start with how you view information itself and how information lives in the world. And that's why, and because animals give information, they transmit information through barks, through yelps, through everything to give very, very basic communication. But that's just phonetic. That's just like, you hear people screaming, you think, oh, that must be bad. There's some humans that don't really rise that much above it, And with writing this down, that's where you also get logic. So if you don't really have the written word, and this is going back to the Greeks, and that's where, if you want to pin where this really started to go, this entire idea of information theory, it starts with the Greeks. Because once you have the written word and you can look at a message as if it's an equation, you can build a mathematics of communication, and the mathematics of communication is logic. That's saying, okay, I have these standardized words. I know what these mean. So what now? They fit together. I'm trying to make an argument. I'm trying to find truth. So it's arguable that without a written language, without this concept of a language and communication, you don't have concepts such as truth. Now that's a big claim, and I might be wrong on that, but I think to measure the truth of something, you actually need to work on it like it's an algorithm or an equation. That's what logic is. Like you build an argument with certain predicates, and then you break them down and see if they lead to the conclusion, and you look at it visually. And if you get into logic, there's lots of different sort of deductive paths you can take with Venn diagrams and truth tables, they're called. But to even start with that, you have to look at language almost as its own thing. And like, what is an idea? And how does language, to make an idea, like there's words that kind of map onto reality, but to make a complicated thought, you need to organize them as an equation. And how does one test the validity of that in an objective way? And again, that's information theory. And now the idea of writing down an idea gets from that. Like, how the fuck do we have fiction? Well, that's how you start it. How do you have a metaphor? That's how you get there. So it's a small thing. All I'm trying to get is it's a small thing that grows into this big all-encompassing thing, and along the way changes not only how you think, but also changes, in my opinion, the shape of your brain, your neural pathways, the developments of parts of your brain that are for abstract thoughts. And we talked about that in the last thing about the human use of human beings, but the part of your brain, it's an actual pool of synapses in your brain that is there for judging the validity of abstract thoughts. So this whole, the development of information, I think, changes, the structure of your brain. And that's something we can go into sometime, but we're just going to gape on the theory right now. On that same pathway, and I'll just mention this quickly, this is how you kind of get to computers. So you have this guy named Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage created what was essentially the first computer with what he called the difference machine. And what it was a big fucking steampunk calculator. This is pre-punch cards, by the way. Punch cards came after. And you have your Alan Turings in the world. But this was a difference machine. And it was this crazy idea that you could like put in a number, and the machine, through all the pistons and the steam and the cranks, would give you all the different ways that number could be calculated and stuff like that.
At his soirees, London's intellectual society watched what you see now. As Babbage cranked its handle, this machine produced a series of polynomial calculations that were repeatable and error-free. Most astonishing, it was automatic. Any of his illustrious guests might have operated the handle as well as Charles Babbage, perhaps the geologist Charles Lyell, or Charles Darwin, or Charles Dickens. Once set, the machine seemed able to proceed, to think on its own.
So it's thinking, but it's thinking with, again, rods and pistons, and it might take a while. And it's how he built, and he developed this over the course of his entire life. And a lot of people looked at it like, hey, what's this for? Yes, it can do a thing. Yes, you put in the number 150,092, and it can tell you all the different mathematical ways to get to that number. But what is that for? And then you get people like we do now, like, what's that for? There's people starving. There's people, the pound sterling is made of cabbage, or whatever it is they complained about back then. But he slaved away at this, and it was kind of like a parlor trick maybe, but no one grasped onto like, oh, what he's doing is he's making mathematics real. This is engineering. It's taking this thing called addition and multiplication and division and making this something that a machine can do, which if you really think about it is a mind-blowing idea. Because now mathematics lives in the real world inside of this machine. And that's and from this, we start looking at the brain and things like that, but we won't get to that. But the transition of the language of our symbols into the real world, into something you can like hold in your hand. And that's really the revolution that we're talking about. And it goes back to the Greeks. As an abstract conception, the difference machine generated excitement that did not need to wait for anything so mundane as the machine's actual construction. The idea was landing in fertile soil. Dionysius Larner, a popular lecturer on technical subjects, devoted a series of public talks to Babbage, hailing his, quote, proposition to reduce arithmetic to the domain of mechanism, to substitute an automaton for the compositor, to throw the powers of thought into the wheelwork. The engine, quote, must be completed, he said, produce important effects not only for the progress of science, but on that of civilization. It would be the rational machine. It would be a junction point for two roads, mechanism and thought. Its admirers sometimes struggled with the explanation of the intersection. The question is set to the instrument, Henry Colebrook told the Astronomical Society, or the instrument is set to the question. Either way, he said, by simply giving motion to the solution is wrought. But the engine made slower progress in the realm of brass and wrought iron. Anyway, so what he was saying there was basically like this was a kind of revolutionary idea of bringing thought into machinery. And like, what is thought? That is, working your way through an equation. And he dreamed. He said, we can do this with mathematics, but I see it for music. I see it for creative endeavors, which is practically what we do now. But as he was designing this, he was asking the question, why could not I get this machine to make music, to make fiction, to make whatever we want? Because he's seeing in this massive construction that, it can make you put in one thing and something else comes out. What a crazy fucking idea, And people couldn't be that imaginative, but some were. A lot of the scientists were like, well, I guess why not, right? And then from there, that was a very specific thing. Then you get the differential analyzer. That was the next machine that they came up with. And that was sort of the analog of the computer, marrying machines with logic.
Complex as UCLA's cyclotron is its new differential analyzer. This amazing mechanical brain quickly solves mathematical problems that would require months by ordinary computing methods. The brain is becoming an invaluable aid in our aircraft capital.
And this is where you get circuit relays. And circuit relays are essentially binary. It's like a yes-no thing. If this is open, then that's open. And with the differential analyzer, now you're building a machine that actually thinks like the human brain. Because if you look at the human brain is like a circuit pathway. It's very, very complicated. It's very, very intricate. But a lot of the pathways are based on sort of yes-no things and if-then statements. So with the evolution of machinery, you see the evolution of logic. And it's around this time you see new logical ideas start to develop as well in academia. But that's why it's so interesting that now they say, let's start building a machine like the human brain. And we still haven't stopped doing that as far as I'm concerned. If I had to pick the one trajectory of all digital or all computational stuff is just to reproduce the human brain. It's not like a new thing. Artificial intelligence didn't fall out of the sky. This was going back to the fucking 1600s. And I would say that's the sole through line of all of this machinery, really. You know, a lot of the machinery that goes alongside that is just repetitive tasks, but people want to be surprised by stuff and they want to figure out. And as this develops, so did our relationship with the concept of information, because now it lives in the real world. And the average person is starting to figure that out. And it's through this understanding of information living in the real world that we start to develop the idea of entropy as it relates to information. It's like, oh, so information is being passed along this sort of circuit board, and it's being lost. Something is affecting it. It's dying along the way. The information being transferred is degrading. What is this thing called information degradation? And so as you start doing that, then you start rethinking how messages are. And once you start rethinking how messages are constructed, you really get to the heart of information theory, which is kind of what I'm trying to get at here. It's like, how do we build a stronger message that can last the duration, ideally forever? Because going back to like fucking Plato, going back to the foundation of language, what we're really trying to do is just replicate information between points perfectly. And that's kind of what we're doing when we have kids. We want to replicate perfectly, keep all the good stuff and maybe make it even better. That's what, and on a practical engineering level, from an electrical level, that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure everything is working perfectly and doing all that stuff. But then we have to think, well, how do we make it so information transmits perfectly? You know, kind of like DNA. And then that's when you start breaking down what a good message is. So like the theory that they came up with that I really like is that of redundancy. And we'll take redundancy in language as an example. So redundancy is usually you call like a message that's too long, or it belabors the point, or it repeats itself too much. And that's one way to look at it, but it's also that redundancy that makes it so the message can't be misunderstood in transit. You see what I'm saying?
But the history of English spelling is moving from higher entropy to lower entropy, and paradoxically, some of the confusion is the result of that shift. More and more patterns and information have been added to make English easier to read. In ancient Latin and Greek, for instance, there were no spaces between words, no capital letters. Well, actually only capital letters. Lowercase wasn't invented until the Middle Ages. And no punctuation. But the thing is, English doesn't work as well without vowels as Phoenician did. And that's part of the story of why languages such as ancient Greek, Latin, and English have added so many extras to the writing system.
A lot of times to make a message stronger isn't actually to make it simpler. And if you make it simpler, you need to make it so the words are so specific they can't be misunderstood.
I just want to go on a tangent for a second, because this is something, doing management in a country where my language is not the native language and that their language is a fucking weird language that is not good for technical communication. I hope this doesn't come through that much when I'm speaking now, but I've developed a way when I'm speaking technically where I consciously will repeat the same statement 3 or 4 or even 5 times. I'll just reword it. So I'll say it one way and I'll reword it again. I'm doing it right now, actually. I just explained to you in abstract and I'm going to describe it to you. And now I'm going to give you an example. Then I'm going to give you a second example. Now you have 4 different phrases or sentences which, if written and analyzed, actually just contain the same information. So if you were not listening, you were only listening to 1/4 of that, you still had a fairly good chance of understanding what I said, because otherwise the information would degrade.
That's a good point, actually, like repeating yourself. And we're using language as an example, but this idea of making a message stronger, that is what you're doing. You're making it so entropy can't degrade it. And again, what is entropy? Entropy, as we defined in the last episode, it's not just chaos. It's not just construction. Entropy scientifically means the available energy that's within a little system. So you could have a system where there's just no energy and it's just dead matter. That's entropy. So an example of that with language would be you're delivering a message and the entropy has degraded so much that's just sounds and gibberish now, like static. And it's nonsense. And you can tell something's being said, but there actually isn't something in there. And again, look at information theory. Like, what is the difference between a shitty message and just gibberish, right? Gibberish actually has no information in it, even though it has all the components of like words and they're arranged in a certain way, you know. But to understand what information is, understand they could have two sentences that both have words and both have punctuation, but one could actually have information and one can't. So now you're looking at, oh, that's information as an sort of a metaphysical thing, but also manifested in the physical realm. So that's a good way to wrap your head around information, and playing around with the idea of redundancy and making it stronger, and realizing that he says this in the book. He says new information should be surprising. And he said you can kind of play around with what redundancy is by like taking letters out of a word. How many letters can you take out of the average word before you still understand what it means? And you see this with social media companies taking vowels out of their names. Like Twitter is still Twitter without the E's or the I's, you know? So that's an interesting thing, that you could Twitter is so informationally relevant that you could even kind of break down the word and still know what it means. This is where you get in like weird mathematics of like information versus words themselves. But, you know, if you're explaining a very complex idea that no one knows, you're going to need a lot more words. You know, you're going to have to be redundant. You're going to need to repeat yourself. You see this in law as well. Sometimes you got to like reiterate yourself a lot of times, which is kind of also what I'm doing now. And along the way, as you're changing your understanding of all this stuff, you're changing the language itself. So an example he gives, I kind of touched on this before, was the development of logic. Now, logic's existed for a long time. You know, logic, as going back to the Greeks, of the mathematics of words and the mathematics of an argument. We have had that. We've had the Socratic method forever. But what we found was once engineering was brought into it, engineering and mathematics and stuff brought new symbols with it. So the entire investigative power of logic was reinvigorated as we brought in all these like new symbols, right? New mathematical symbols. So now if you read a logic textbook now, a lot of these like weird symbols you see in relationships, that only came as our understanding of what information is developed alongside engineering and mathematics. And now it's not like we're looking at mathematics more linguistically. We're looking at linguistics more mathematically and engineering like. So that's an interesting thing that people don't account for, that our average understanding of communication is so impacted by engineering and mathematics, and we don't really know it, and how we break. And the very fact that we can even discuss this stuff on Reddit, we all hate Reddit. We all hate fucking everyone on Reddit's an idiot, but even the idiots of the world have an understanding of mathematical deductive reasoning that would fucking shock and awe anyone from the 1500s. You know, like the dumbest people we got actually have a very, and I heard, you know, I always bring this guy up, I'm sorry, but Curtis Yarvin mentions Moldbug. He had made a comment about a movie like Inception wouldn't make any sense to like people from like the Great Depression, maybe. Like the movie Inception of like dreams within dreams. It's like, oh, time changes as I'm falling through different realities, and those realities impact me physically. Like that requires like an assumed psychological understanding that would be just completely lacking to people throughout history. So we have a meta understanding of not only thinking, but thinking about thinking, and the right and wrong ways of thinking about thinking. Like we live in a very crazy time to have a human mind, is what I'm saying. But how we got here, is what I'm saying, is the influence of mathematics and engineering. And they all kind of advancing together and changing how we understand logic and understand understanding. So that's just something I wanted to say about this thing called information theory. And just on the topic of how we think and we communicate and things like that, we talk about the concept of recoding, which I thought was really interesting. And this all comes from, again, sort of a computational way of looking at it. And like as we communicate, we develop things like the telegraph, we develop things like computational bits and stuff, which gets us thinking, wow, is there such a thing as bit for, you know, quantum mechanics, for information, for the idea of information? Like, do we think in bits? Do we speak in bits? And we talk about bits as just a unit of measure, like you would a quart or a liter or something, or a droplet. So a bit is like a droplet or like a photon or something like that, but it measures information. And they're like, well, what is what's the lowest amount of information you can get to? Because like quantum mechanics, you're saying, okay, how small can we actually get? Because you can't get infinitely small. That's what some people think, but you can't. There is a limit to how small you can get in the quantum world, and that's important. People perform acts of what information theorists call recoding, grouping information into larger and larger chunks. For example, organizing telegraph dots and dashes into letters, and those letters into words, and those words into phrases. By now, the argument had become something in the nature of a manifesto. Recoding seems, according to this guy, Miller, seems to me to be the very lifeblood of the thought processes. So think of it that way. Like, hey, what is information? There's a unit of information. That unit of information might be like a telegraph. So a telegraph uses dots and dashes, but those dashes can form letters, and those letters into words, and and we keep grouping things into larger and larger concepts. So what's the smallest concept, a human being can get to? It might be like a sound or a very, very simple idea, or the idea of red or something. But there is like a limit to how small the communication channel can get. But what we do is we recode it ourselves. And so when we communicate information, what we're trying to do is like get the right encoding machines lined up. And this, I think, presents severe limitations on how people can communicate with each other across languages, because what a language is just a recoding machine. And what a recoding machine is built from, history, values, genetics, all that stuff. So there's certain ideas that just don't translate. And anyone who's done translation knows this. And anyone who has done even voiceover work, the entire idea of localization, like the idea of transmitting a thought that your recoding machine can't even process properly. That's a big problem. That's part of entropy too. And so fighting the entropy of that message is like making sure you've got the right machines communicating to each other. Anyway, but the only reason I'm saying all this is to kind of give a scope of information theory. Like, what is information? How do we understand it? How does the transmission of information affect our lives? And how are we information? Because the argument can be made that we are just information. We are just replicating patterns in a certain configuration that is trying to exist in the world longer than it should. That's kind of what language is. Because language, just to bring it back to the original thing, language is us trying to fight off entropy. That's all it is. We're trying to take a message from our head, replicate it in someone else's mind, essentially, and make it so that in transit, it doesn't just break down. So sometimes that's making more and more specific language. Sometimes that's repetition. Sometimes there's all kinds of tricks, but it's all to service the goal of making something last longer than it should. Because it's arguable that all human life, in fact, scratch that, all life, period, is replication in the interest of fighting entropy. And that's all evolution is, actually. Evolution is trying to figure out as we go how to adapt to changing entropy, how to get better at it, how to live longer, how to have more offspring, how to have those offspring live longer. That is just, in a way, if you want to look at it that way, information replicating itself, biological information, because DNA is information. Just like a message is information. And what that means is that your DNA is more like a message than you think, and the message you're sending is more like an organic organism than you think. And I think that's all I wanted to kind of get with that, to show the coupling of the hands between these two worlds, because the development of information theory is the coupling of hands of many different areas of thought impacting each other and changing quite literally how we think. And anyway, that's all I kind of wanted to say. There's a lot we can go with this, but I thought this put a nice hat on the last one. But what do you think? I know you've had...
No, I like that, actually. Like, the first time I thought about this was reading... I don't remember the name of the book, but it's a Ray Kurzweil book about transhumanism.
The Gay Times?
It was called The Gay Times by Ray Kurzweil. It was a thing about. It's just like a futurist book, but it was talking a lot about that. And in fairness, also Selfish Gene talks about this a little bit, like this the nature of information as a concept, and we live in the information age, and everybody, like, there's a lot of connotations to information, like you mentioned earlier, have to do with media and mathematics, and everybody's kind of familiar with that because we actually use that colloquially in our lives. But information almost as a philosophical concept, the idea of information is much deeper than that and is much more tied to, I don't know. To me, it's like the relationship between information, like colloquial information, and then the true abstract nature of information is kind of like most people's understanding of economics and value, and then the praxeological true value, like meaning and the truth of value, where it's like you can, love and passion and dignity and integrity and respect and all these things can have quote unquote value, even though you can't assign a dollar to them. So like there's a lot of depth to the study of information, and I'm interested. I like that. It's good. I like it.
Yeah. There's other quotes I can do here, but we do have to kind of get going here. We already explained entropy. I was going to go down more of the concepts of entropy, but we explained that in our last clip too. So I think that's there's other stuff we can get into about like the history of how computers are made is almost a clip in itself. But just watching the evolution and remembering that computers, the internet's one thing, but computers started off as like, what if we make a human brain the size of a building? And that's how they started. And then, yeah, you can. It'll be kind of ugly and you'll have like fucking steam shooting off in your face. But, that guides where we're going right now. So if you want to know where we're going, realize that this is a conversation we've been having for a few centuries now. And that's, I think, the further we go, it will be the marriage of machine and biological matter. And I think whenever we try to imagine what it looks like in the future, we always have a very reductive version of it. We imagine like an ugly Frankenstein monster of like bones with fucking wires coming out of it. And, that would be a blessing because that would be easier to notice. I think the marriage between cybernetics and biological organisms such as ourselves will be so subtle that you won't notice it. It's like, oh, they're going to be putting microchips in you. It's like, no, what they're going to do is they're going to make a new type of blood. And that new type of blood is going to be in you. Think about that. It's not going to be like a cyberpunk augmentation thing, because they're not trying to make machines. They're not trying to make us more like machines or machines more like us. They're trying to kind of bring us together at the same time into one consistent lane so that eventually this thing called computers won't live in a big clunky box. We've already kind of started seeing that with like, we're wrapping our heads around that. We started wrapping our heads around that with the cloud. Like, what is the cloud? It's like, well, it's kind of in the air. It's kind of data and it lives in servers, but we don't really know how it works. That's what the metaverse is. Like with every step along this, we are changing our relationship with the machines and also our relationship with how we understand information. So what you are going to see is there will no longer, in the future, I don't know when, but at some point there will be a complete fusion of the digital and real world. And what that means is the thing that fuses that will be your brain. And it might be a genetics thing. It might be a surgical thing. My belief, I tilt towards thinking that their solution is going to be at a level of elegance where it won't seem horrific to you, kind of like abortion. If the goal of abortion is birth control and power over bodily autonomy and stuff, abortion is a bit too grotesque for people. But they're going to find a solution for birth control that is just a pill or some kind of funky radiation. Stuff's on the table. They're talking. I'm sure they've talked about, can we use radiation to get what we want? There's no question in my mind they've done that. Yeah. Anyway, we're going up. But that is like what information theory is. It's the marriage of all those things. And I think it behooves us to look at information differently. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.